off this list, in our number 10 spot, we have the 18th President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant. I am certainly no American political expert, but by what I read about Ulysses Grant, he seemed to be a pretty alright guy. His death came on July 23, 1885, after he lost his battle with throat cancer. His last spoken word was water, which is pretty sad considering what he was going through. But he did lose the ability to speak sometime before his death, so a more accurate portrayal of his last words would be something he wrote shortly before he passed. He wrote, "There was never one more willing to go than I." That is so dark and sad to think that he was just kind of done with life. But after suffering a painful disease, I can understand why. He certainly lived quite the life, as he made it all the way to being the president. He was only 63 at the time, but I feel like by 1885 standards, that might have been pretty old. Heading on down to number 9, we have the 20th President of the United States, James Garfield. James had a similar outlook to a lot of people at the time and thought that the assassination of Abraham Lincoln was just a fluke and denied the opportunity to have security guards around him constantly. Unfortunately, on July 2nd, 1881, this decision led to him getting shot twice by a man who was trying to assassinate him. James lived for a few months after, but was struggling pretty hard to survive because of the lack of medical technology available to remove the bullet that was still lodged in him. On the day of his death, James laid down to rest before he awoke, clutching his chest. His friend, General David Swaim, was by his side, and James reached out for him and asked, "Swaim, can't you stop this pain?" These were his final words, and it's so sad to know that he passed in such pain, but I'm glad he had his friend near to him at the time. In our number 8 spot today, we have the 21st President of the United States, Chester Alan Arthur. Before I dive into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit that thumbs up because it really helps us out. Chester was actually the 20th Vice President, but became the 21st President after the death of James Garfield. After his presidency was finished, Chester went back to work at his New York law firm. He had some health issues already, so he wasn't working a ton, but on November 16th, 1885, he ordered for all of his personal and official papers to be burned, which seems like kind of weird behavior. The following day, he suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and never regained consciousness until he passed the next day. While Chester's last words weren't officially recorded, a friend of his said that his last words to him were that life is not worth living. This is a pretty dark message to leave someone, but maybe Chester didn't know that this was the last time that he would speak to this friend.
Number 7. Eileen Wuornos. Eileen Wuornos was an American serial slayer and prostitute who operated in Florida. In 1989 to 1990, while engaging in street prostitution along highways, she shot and robbed 7 of her male clients. Now, she claimed that her clients had either taken advantage of or tried to take advantage of her, and that all the deaths were committed in self-defense. Eileen was sentenced to death for 6 of the deaths, and on October 9th, 2002, after 12 years on Florida's death row, she was executed by lethal injection. Her last words were, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day, with Jesus, June 6th. Like the movie, big mothership and all, I'll be back." Now, that's incredibly unsettling, and I do not like that she said that at all. Number 6. Charles Manson. Charles Manson was a criminal who created a cult called the Manson family. It was active in California in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Now, the group consisted of approximately 100 followers who lived an unconventional lifestyle and frequently used psychoactive substances. Now, according to group member Susan Atkins, the members of the family became convinced that Manson was a manifestation of Jesus Christ. Now, some of the members committed a series of 9 deaths at 4 locations in July and August of 1969. In 1971, Manson was convicted of first-degree homicide and conspiracy to commit homicide for the deaths of 7 people, including the film actress Sharon Tate. The prosecution contended that while Manson never directly ordered the deaths, his ideology constituted an overt act of conspiracy. Now, on March 4th, 1971, during sentencing hearings, Manson trimmed his beard to a fork and shaved his head, telling the media, "I am the devil, and the devil always has a bald head." Then on March 29th, 1971, the jury sentenced him to death. Manson, though, died from cardiac arrest resulting from respiratory failure brought on by colon cancer at a hospital on November 19th, 2017. His last words were, "I'm the most famous human being not only that is alive, but the most famous human being that has ever lived." Yeah, you can tell he still had a big ego even while looking into the eyes of death. Number 5. Salvador Ramos. You may not know this man's name, but you do know his crime. On May 24th, 2022, Salvador Ramos and his 66-year-old grandmother had an argument over his failure to graduate from high school, during which he shot her in the face before taking her black 2008 Ford F-150. Ramos, using his Facebook account, sent 3 private messages to a girl from Germany whom he had met online. The first said that he was going to shoot his grandmother, the second said that he had shot his grandmother, and a third, about 15 minutes before the said that he was going to open fire at an elementary school. He went to Robb Elementary School, his former school, and fatally 19 students and 2 teachers, while 17 others were injured but survived. Now, details are still fuzzy about what happened, as it took the police forever to get into the building to take Salvador down, but what I could gather is he was in a room and opened the door and said goodnight before officers. In return, the officers back, ending his life. Number 4. Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez, dubbed the Night Stalker, had a highly publicized home invasion and life-ending spree that terrorized the residents of the greater Los Angeles area and later the San Francisco Bay Area over the course of 14 months. Richard cultivated a strong interest in Satanism and the occult and would often commit burglaries to support his addiction, many of which were later frequently accompanied by ending people's lives and taking advantage of them. Now, he also frequently enjoyed degrading and humiliating his victims, especially those who survived his attacks or whom he explicitly decided to live by forcing them to profess that they loved Satan or telling them to swear on Satan. Now, he was eventually caught, and in 1989 he was convicted of 13 counts of taking someone's life, 5 attempts of taking someone's life, 11 counts of taking advantage of a person, and 14 burglaries. He was sentenced to death and was on death row. While awaiting his scheduled death, he died on June 7th, 2013 due to health complications, but his last words were, "I am beyond good and evil, I will be avenged." All I gotta say is, I hope he doesn't get avenged. Number 3. Albert Fish. Albert Fish ended the lives of many of the young and was suspected in at least 5 homicides. He was nicknamed the Boogeyman for his predatory behavior. He confessed to 3 deaths that police were able to trace to a known homicide, and he confessed to stabbing at least 2 other people. Now, Albert once boasted that his number of victims was about 100. He abducted Grace Budd in 1928, and in an abandoned home in Westchester County, New York, he ended her life and devoured her body. He wrote a letter to Grace's mother telling her about the crimes he committed against her daughter. He said, "When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run downstairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. How did she kick, bite, and scratch? I then cut her into small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook, and eat it." Now, this is extremely disturbing, and I cannot imagine how her mother felt, and as a result, he was executed on January 16th, 1936 in the electric chair, and his last words were reportedly, "I don't even know why I'm here." Which again is disturbing, because did he really think he didn't deserve to die after the horrible crimes he committed? Number 2. Carl Panzram. Carl Panzram was a serial slayer, arsonist, burglar, and someone who took advantage of men. In prison confessions and in his autobiography, he confessed to having committed 21 deaths, only 5 of which could be corroborated. He's suspected of ending the lives of more than 100 men in the United States alone, and several more in Portuguese Angola. He also confessed to having committed more than 1,000 acts of taking advantage of men. His last words were, "In my lifetime, I have murdered 22 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons, and last but not least, I've committed sodomy on more than 1,000 male human beings. For all these things, I am not the least bit sorry." Now, again, that's just plain disturbing, as he had no remorse at all. And coming at number 1 is Jake Bird. In 1949, Jake Berg, sometimes referred to as the Tacoma Axe Killer, was arrested by police after breaking into the home of Bertha Klutt and her daughter Beverly June Klutt and ending their lives with an axe. Upon questioning by authorities, Jake revealed intimate knowledge of 33 other deaths of Caucasian women, which made him a prime suspect for those as well. On July 15, 1949, Jake was hanged at the Washington State Penitentiary, but not before he uttered what would be later known as the Bird Hex in his final statement. He said, "I'm putting the Jake Bird Hex on all of you who had anything to do with my being punished. Mark my words, you will die before I do." Now, the real scary thing about this is that within a year of his execution, 6 people connected to this case did die. So, is it a curse? Was it a coincidence? Who knows?
Starting off at number 10 now, we have Kurt Cobain. The Nirvana frontman was as famously talented as he was troubled. He returned to the US after a tour in Germany and was faced with a drug intervention from his wife and close friends. Although he initially agreed to the program, he escaped the facility and a week later his body was found. He had killed himself with a shotgun to the head. The suicide note he wrote addresses his wife, his children, and his lost passion in life. The final line simply read, "It is better to burn out than to fade away." Next up at number 9 now we have Leonardo da Vinci. Not many people in human history have had such a big impact on art, science, music, and engineering as Da Vinci. His paintings are instantly recognizable, and his inventions for early parachutes, helicopters, and tanks were held back only by the technology around him. You'd think that a man like that would have some sort of pride in himself, but surprisingly not. When he died from a stroke in 1519 at the age of 67, Da Vinci's last words were, "I have offended God and mankind because my work did not reach the quality it should have." Well, what hope do the rest of us have then? Coming in at number 8 now, we have Elvis Presley. He is undoubtedly one of the biggest musical and cultural icons of all time and had adoring fans all over the world. Now, towards the end of his life, he suffered with obesity and drug addiction. On August 16th, 1977, age 42, he turned to his partner, Ginger Alden, and said, "I'm going to the bathroom to read." That's exactly what he did. Unfortunately, years of drug and food abuse meant that when he strained, his heart suddenly stopped. He was found dead with his face on the floor.
Number 7, Steve Jobs. A little more modern, there we go. When I was making this list, I couldn't believe how long it's been since Steve Jobs has passed away. It's been a while. The tech icon's last moments were in 2011. He was surrounded with love. He had beside him his sister Patty, his children, and his partner Laureen. Steve looked above them and said, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." He said "oh wow" 3 times. That's pretty heavy stuff to hear. Steve's last moments were shared furthermore when his sister wrote in his eulogy, "Even now he had a stern, still handsome profile, the profile of an absolutist, a romantic." Number 6, Nostradamus. I predict that you'll hit that thumbs up. That's inappropriate, but we try our best. The astrologer's last words were in itself predictions. And this last prediction he sadly got right. Nostradamus, full name Michel de Nostradam, published a book on prophecies back in 1555, and in it he had 942 pieces of writing. He had these poems that told the future, right? These texts have supposedly hinted towards the JFK attack, meteors hitting Earth, the invasion of France, global warming, you name it. He said some eerie things about such topics, and he also predicted his own death. On paper, he did. It was his last ever prediction. It was July 1st, 1566. His priest said to him, "Until tomorrow," and Nostradamus replied, "You will not find me alive at sunrise." Sadly, he was correct. Number 5, Beethoven. Another icon, another staple in history, the German composer Ludwig van Beethoven. We've recently heard his work in theaters. In Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, Doctor Strange fights the villain with musical notes. He uses these notes. He uses Beethoven's Symphony No. 5 in C minor. Now we've heard Beethoven in IMAX, right? What a time to be alive. When Ludwig was still alive, he faced many health problems. Hepatitis, jaundice, skin diseases, cirrhosis of the liver, and of course, deafness. When his time came on March 26, 1827, the composer was believed to have said, "Applaud, my friends, the comedy is over." This is false. This is not true at all. Beethoven's close friend, Anselm Hüttenbrenner, who was very much present during his friend's passing, he said his last words were about the case of red wine that had just been delivered from his publisher. Ludwig's true last words followed, and they were, "Pity, pity, too late." About the wine. Fair. More than fair. It was a little too late. Number 4, Marie Antoinette. Another older one, but I figured I'd go more Victorian for this list, you know? Instead of like recent celebrities, that's only depressing. We don't want to talk about those. During the height of the French Revolution, Louis XVI of France and Marie Antoinette were both charged with treason. The phrase, "let them eat cake," is often associated with Mrs. Antoinette in this case, but her last words were actually an apology. Not to the people in which they owed it to, but to the executioner whose foot she stepped on whilst approaching the guillotine. Yeah, shows like Game of Thrones make it look easy to say something cool right before your, demise. In reality, I would beg for my life. Looking up at this dude? Yeah, I would plead. I'd be like, please don't do this. I really don't want this to happen. Number 3, Bob Marley. Of course, we have to mention the one and only reggae legend, Bob Marley, okay? Cancer was the reason that this icon met his fate early, the big C, once again. Marley was only 36 years old when he passed away in 1981. Next to him, he had his son Ziggy, and to him he shared the final words. And I think we could all learn a little something here. He said to Ziggy, "Money can't buy life." Yeah, I'll say that again. Money can't buy life. Not happiness, life. Bob Marley's death was so impactful that the Jamaican government turned this sad day into a national holiday. Yeah, that's a great idea. Live some more of that life. Take the day off. Blast some Marley and, you know the rest. Stuff I can't talk about, light some candles, right? That's an ideal way to mourn somebody as impactful as Bob Marley. I'm here for it. Number 2. Giles Corey. Out of the 27 people who had their lives taken away from them during the 1692 Salem witch trials, 19 were hanged, 17 passed away in prison while serving their sentence, and the last victim, Giles Corey, refused to plead either innocent or guilty. And the law at the time states that you can't be tried otherwise, so he did what was ultimately best for him and his family and his estate. The townsfolk laid a heavy board on top of the 81-year-old man during the witch trials and all that nonsense, and then over the course of 2 days, boulders were slowly added, making the weight more and more unbearable. They were hoping that Giles would admit something, either being innocent or guilty, whatever the case, but every time they asked him anything, Giles responded with, "More weight." How epic is that? Extremely brave. This is something like, it sounds easy, but in reality, I would never do this. I would fold immediately. I would be like, this is so hard. But sadly, after 2 days of this torture, Giles passed away. He fought for so long and did what he could because if he had gone either of the other 2 ways, Giles would have his property taken away from the town. But since he passed away not admitting guilt, he was still in full possession of his estate, which immediately went to his son-in-law. And finally, number 1, Robin Williams. Okay, I wanted to end on one that really hit home for me personally. I try and bring comedy into these lists whenever I can. It's like, cursed dolls that will haunt your family. I'm like, okay, I try and jazz it up a bit. I try and add some physicality to it whenever I can, brighten the mood. Because I was raised watching this man right here. Robin sadly passed away in August 2014. I was 19 at the time. I still remember the day, right? It was the first celebrity death that actually did something to me physically. And I don't mean for that to sound sensitive, but I grew up with this man, right? He was like Hook, Aladdin, robots, so underrated, right? Robin's wife Susan Schneider Williams revealed her husband's last words in an interview with ABC. And when the couple was getting ready for bed the night before, his last words were, "Good night, good night." Yeah, I wanted to end on a nice, good, peaceful note instead of something horrible from the 1700s. There we go.
For now though, let's get into our number 10 with Terry Kath. He was the guitarist and one of the lead singers for the famous rock band Chicago. Now he had a self-admitted history of drug and alcohol abuse and had developed a bit of a habit of carrying guns around and playing with them. On January 23rd, 1978, after a party at a friend's house in LA, he was playing around with his unloaded guns and pulling the trigger next to his head. Eventually, he picked up a semi-automatic 9mm pistol and told his friends, "Don't worry about it, look, the clip is not even in it." Unfortunately, the gun still had a single round in the chamber. Kath put the gun to his head, pulled the trigger, and instantly died. Those became his last words, telling his friends not to worry. Next up at number 9 now, we have Michael Jackson. The death of the King of Pop was overshadowed somewhat in many ways by the trial of Conrad Murray, Jackson's doctor at the time of his death, who was convicted of killing Jackson. He gave Jackson a powerful hospital anesthetic, which he subsequently overdosed on. Jackson's nickname for this anesthetic was Milk. Conrad Murray said that Jackson's last words to him were, "I'd like to have some milk, please give me some more." Moving on to number 8 now, we have Sam Cooke. Born in Mississippi in 1931, Sam Cooke went on to become one of the most famous soul and gospel singers of all time. I love his music, you guys should definitely listen to him if you haven't done so already. By 1964, his career was really just getting started at the age of 33. On December 11th of that year, he was staying at the Hacienda Motel in LA. A woman called Elisa Boyer had accompanied Cooke back to his hotel room, but after feeling uncomfortable with him, she gathered up her clothes and left the hotel while he was in the bathroom. She accidentally took some of his clothes too. According to the motel manager, Cooke then came downstairs and tried to break into the office in a rage, demanding to know the whereabouts of the woman. The manager, Bertha Franklin, then shot him in what she said was self-defense as Cooke approached to attack her. He died soon after. His last words were simply, "Lady, you shot me." Many of Cooke's acquaintances have doubted the official story and feel that Cooke was wrongfully killed.
Moving on to number 7, we have Frida Kahlo. Kahlo. Famous artist Frida Kahlo was said to be one of Mexico's greatest artists. She began painting mainly self-portraits after a bus accident that left her severely injured. From there, her artwork became well known, and they were exhibited in Paris and Mexico before her death. About a week after her 47th birthday on July 13, 1954, she passed away. Her last words were in her diary entry, and it read, "I hope exit is joyful, and I hope never to come back." Now, it's said that she passed away from a pulmonary embolism, but others believe that she took her own life. At that point in her life, she did have a couple of failed attempts. This was because she had to have her right leg amputated below her knee from a gangrene infection, and that really affected her. It's really sad that her final words are basically saying how she wanted to die and then never come back. In our sixth spot, we have Paul Walker. Paul Walker was an actor known primarily for the series The Fast and the Furious. He passed away on November 30th, 2013 after attending a charity event. Paul's last words were, "We'll be back in 5 minutes." This was said to Jim Torp, a man working at the event, but sadly, Paul never returned back. He got into a car that his friend was driving, and a little while later, they crashed into a concrete lamppost and 2 trees before it burst into flames, killing Walker and the driver instantly. We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with John Lennon, an amazingly talented singer and songwriter who was the founder and co-lead vocalist for the Beatles. On December 8th, 1980, John Lennon was assassinated outside of his Manhattan apartment. The man that took his life was a fan that traveled all the way from Hawaii. Apparently, he didn't like Lennon's lifestyle and how he was portraying himself to the press. On that night, he waited outside of Lennon's apartment and then shot him 4 times in the back. Lennon's last words were, "I'm shot, I'm shot." He repeated it twice, and that was the last thing he ever said. Rest in peace, John Lennon.
Witnesses told police Lennon was shot near the door to his apartment building as he and Yoko Ono returned from a recording studio.
I saw John and Yoko get out of the limousine. They walked into the gate.
Moving on to number 4, we have Mozart. Mozart was a very well-known and talented composer. He got into music very early on in life and was extremely gifted. But on December 5th, 1791, he passed away at the age of 35. And of course, there's a bunch of theories as to how he died. Some say he was poisoned by his rival, but it's believed that he died from a disease that led to a severe fever, causing him to slip into a coma. But we still don't know what disease led to his death. Anyways, one of the last things he ever said was, "The taste of death is upon my lips. I feel something that is not of this earth." I mean, that's very artistic, but also it's sad because he knew that he was going to pass away soon. In our 3rd spot, we have Nostradamus. Nostradamus was a very famous man known for being a prophet. Apparently, he could see into the future, and honestly, a lot of his predictions have come true, so people believe that he was legit. Well, Nostradamus actually predicted the exact date of his death. On July 1st, 1566, he made sure to tell his priest all of his last predictions, because he knew that the next day he was going to die. The priest ended the conversation saying, "Until tomorrow," and he replied with, "You will not find me alive at sunrise." He died that night. His last words to another person were, "Tomorrow I shall no longer be here." That's pretty freaky. In our 2nd spot, we have Amy Winehouse, another super talented individual. Like, her voice is incredible. It sends shivers down my spine. But on July 23rd, 2011, Amy passed away from alcohol poisoning. The night before her death, Amy Winehouse met with her doctor and told her that after 3 weeks of being sober, she started drinking again because she was bored. The conversation ended with Winehouse saying, "I don't want to die." And that was one of the last things that she ever said. The next day, the bodyguard found her laying in the same position as she was a couple hours prior. He checked on her, and that's when he knew she was gone. Now, this one breaks my heart because she literally was so worried about dying, and then the very next day, the very thing that she feared happened. And in our number 1 spot, we have Heath Ledger. Heath Ledger was a well-known Australian actor known for starring in movies such as 10 Things I Hate About You, Brokeback Mountain, and The Dark Knight. Sadly, on January 22nd, 2008, he passed away from an accidental prescription drug overdose. The night he died, he was on the phone with his sister who was worried about him. He told her that he was going to take sleeping pills on top of his prescription for a chest cold because he couldn't sleep, but she warned him not to. His last words were, Katie, look. It'll be fine, you know. I just need to get some sleep." Sadly,
he never woke up. Starting off this countdown, we have Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs is famous for co-founding Apple, of course. But sadly, in 2003, he was diagnosed with an unusual form of pancreatic cancer. On October 5th, 2011, almost exactly 8 years since he was first diagnosed, he lost his battle to cancer. According to his family, Steve's final words were, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." He said it 3 times. Then he lost consciousness and died several hours later. They also said that he first looked at his sister Patty, then over to his children, and then to his partner, and then over their shoulders past them. And that's when he said, "Oh wow." So what was it that he saw over their shoulders? Was it the white light everyone talks about? In our 9th spot, we have Steve Irwin, but before I go any further, please make sure to give this video a big thumbs up because it really helps us out. Steve Irwin, otherwise known as the crocodile hunter, was known for getting up close and personal with dangerous creatures like crocodiles or venomous snakes. It seemed like nothing scared him. Sadly, on September 4th of 2006, while filming a documentary called Ocean's Deadliest, Steve got pierced by a stingray's barb. The barb went right through his chest, piercing his heart. Crew helped him onto the boat as he started to bleed to death. One of the crew members, Justin, tried to comfort Steve and said, "Think of your kid, Steve. Hang on, hang on, hang on." One of the crew members, Justin, tried to comfort Steve and said, "Think of your kid, Steve. Hang on, hang on, hang on." Steve just looked up at him and said, "I'm dying." And that was the last thing he said. And at number 8, we have Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra was an American singer and actor that won a number of awards, like an Academy Award, 3 Golden Globes, multiple gold discs, and a Lifetime Achievement Grammy Award. But after being very ill for a number of months, he had a heart attack and died shortly after. His wife was by his side comforting him while this happened, and she revealed that his last words were, "I'm losing it." It's so sad and scary.
Alright, at number 7 now, we have Thomas J. Grasso. Now, he was a convict who was executed in Oklahoma on March 20th, 1995 for 2 murders. As with many inmates on death row, he was asked what exactly he wanted for his final meal. He had 24 steamed mussels, 24 steamed clams, a double cheeseburger from Burger King, 6 spare ribs, 2 strawberry milkshakes, 1.5 of a pumpkin pie with whipped cream, diced strawberries, and a 16-ounce can of spaghetti meatballs. That last one was the problem though for Thomas. He wanted SpaghettiOs, not spaghetti meatballs. His last words before the execution were, "I did not get my SpaghettiOs, I got spaghetti. I want the press to know this." Talk about getting your priorities straight. Okay, moving on to number 6 now, we have Tupac. Any conversation about the greatest rapper of all time will always feature this man's name. On September 7th, 1996, he was in a car with Suge Knight after a boxing match. They pulled up to some traffic lights and then a car next to them wound down their back window and a gunman shot at them repeatedly. When a police officer arrived on the scene, he found Tupac on the floor covered in blood. The officer tried to get a dying declaration from him and asked him who shot him. He looked him in his eyes, took a deep breath and said, "F you." After that, he slipped out of consciousness and never came around again. At the number 5 spot now, we have James Brown. Now, he was known as the godfather of soul and had a career that spanned an amazing 6 decades, influencing millions of musicians in the process. He was still playing shows right up to the end. On December 23rd, 2006, he visited his dentist who was shocked at just how weak and ill he looked, and he told him to go and see a doctor. His condition worsened and he died on Christmas Day from heart failure. His last words were to his manager. He told him, "I'm going away tonight." He took 3 long breaths and fell asleep before dying. Coming at number 4 now, we have Karl Marx. This 19th century philosopher and political theorist founded the notion of Marxism, the belief that capitalism will eventually lead to a class struggle and a communist society. Now, Marx was known to always have something to say on everything. There are literally hundreds of quotes out there attributed to him, which is why people expected an epic final one from him when he died. Before he died, he told those by his side that last words are for fools who haven't said enough. Ironically, that is definitely a pretty good last words quote. Next up at number 3, we have Marie Antoinette. She was Queen of France during the French Revolution. She was found guilty of high treason by the revolutionaries and sentenced to death. It was execution by guillotine. As she walked up to the scaffold, her last words were not about the revolution, her innocence, or her thoughts on life. She simply said, "Pardon me, sir, I meant not to do it." She said it to her ex executioner because she had accidentally stepped on his foot. I don't think the apology was needed, he was about to do a lot worse to her. Coming in at number 2 now, we have Sir Winston Churchill. He was the Prime Minister of the UK during most of World War II and was once voted the greatest Brit of all time. He was known for his quick wit and incredible command of language. He had one of the biggest impacts on British politics and died aged 90. His last words were, "I'm bored with it all." Now, some people expected a more complex quote to remember him by, but others felt like Churchill being bored of life showed that he was going out because he wanted to, and he was doing it on his own terms. Alright, at the number 1 spot now, we have Bob Marley. The Jamaican reggae artist stands as one of the most legendary music acts of the 20th century. In July 1977, he was diagnosed with cancer. Now, over the next 4 years of his life, it spread to the rest of his body. Eventually, his vital functions worsened. He was rushed to hospital in Miami. His son, Ziggy, was by his deathbed. He turned to him and said his final words, "Money can't buy life." For a man that spread so much love through his songs, I think those seem like very fitting last words.
Kicking off the list at number 10, Sir Isaac Newton. Alright, yeah, we'll start this list off back in the early 1700s. Why not? Let's start crying back in the olden days. Sir Isaac Newton lived until he was 80, and back in the 1700s, living until you're 80, why, that's practically unheard of, right? That's insane. Newton started to experience digestion issues, but come 1727, he blacked out and never woke up again. The man died at 84. His last words were sad, of course, as are all of these on this very sad list that I'm doing, in a hopefully not sad way. But they go as follows. "I don't know what I may seem to the world, but as to myself I seem to have been like a boy, playing on the seashore and diverting myself now and then and finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than the ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me." What exactly that means? Let's all talk about it in the comments. Let's try and decipher that. There we go. Number 9, John F. Kennedy. A little more recent, jumping to the 1960s, President John F. Kennedy was killed while riding in a motorcade. We all know this one, of course. I don't have to go into grim detail about what happened here. He was riding alongside his wife, of course, First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, and in front of him there was Texas Governor John Connally and his wife Nellie. They were all rolling along when Nellie said to John, "You certainly can't say that the people of Dallas haven't given you a nice welcome." The president then said back, "No, I certainly can't." And just moments later, that's when he met his fate. Number 8, Alfred Hitchcock. This man went out with a zinger. Classic, what a classic drama queen. Alfred Hitchcock worked alongside famous painters and literary figures throughout history. He's an icon. He teamed up with Cary Grant, Jimmy Stewart, Dorothy Parker, you name it. In his 1945 film Spellbound, Alfred even brought on Salvador Dali, like the real Salvador Dali, to help him with the film's dream sequences, right? He had a vision, he knew what he was doing. He also terrified many people for years to come. It's also a fun one. Hitchcock is known for going great lengths to keep his endings a secret, like Psycho, for example, a 1960s classic. The ad department for the film told audiences to please not give away the ending, as it's the only one they have. That's fun, that's cute. Weirdly mirrors his last words in real life. As he was dying, Alfred said, "One never knows the ending. One has to die to know exactly what happens after death, although Catholics have their hopes." That sounds very Alfred Hitchcocky.
In our number 7 spot, we have the 22nd and the 24th President of the United States, Grover Cleveland. Grover has not been regarded as a particularly great president, and it has been said that his greatest accomplishment might have been the introduction that he gave so that the more modern presidency that began with Theodore Roosevelt could emerge. In the fall of 1907, Grover fell very ill, and in 1908, he ended up suffering a heart attack. On June 24th, 1908, he ended up passing away with his last words being, "I have tried so hard to do right." I think this is pretty dark because it's sad to think that he was worried about the impact he had left on the world in his final moments. Death really does seem like the worst time to start having an existential crisis. In our number 6 spot, we have the 23rd President of the United States, Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin was actually the grandson of the 9th president, making them the only grandfather-grandson duo to have both held office. He was a Republican who took office in between the terms of Grover Cleveland and lost out on re-election. He definitely isn't ranked among the top or best presidents, but his commitment and his integrity are are not questioned. Benjamin had an interesting personal life, considering after his wife passed, he remarried, but it just so happens that the woman he chose was the 37-year-old niece and former secretary of his late wife. In February of 1901, Benjamin was diagnosed with influenza, which at the time was called grippe. He was treated the best way that they knew how at the time, but on March 13th, at the age of 67, he ended up passing away. What the doctors had thought was influenza was actually pneumonia, which was the cause of his death. His last words were, "Are the doctors here? Doctor, my lungs." It's super sad to know that he was in pain, and I'm not sure if they knew what pneumonia was in 1901, but if they did, it would be such a shame that he was misdiagnosed and mistreated. Pneumonia isn't fun even in 2020 when we have better ways of treating it. In our 5th spot and halfway mark, we have the 32nd President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Franklin still holds the record for the longest time in office, as he was elected 4 consecutive times. Of course, this was before the 2-term limit that now exists. Franklin is regarded as one of the best presidents there's ever been, but of course there have been plenty of people who criticized his policies and positions, but also because of the fact that he was the president for most of World War II, his response to that was also highly scrutinized. Franklin was able to serve 3 terms entirely and was 2 months and 23 days into his 4th term when he passed. On April 12th of 1945, Franklin was sitting for a portrait when he said, "I have a terrific headache." He then slumped over in his chair, and upon examination by his attending cardiologist, he ended up passing away from an intracerebral hemorrhage. It's crazy to think that he had no idea what he was just seconds away from, and that he really did just think he had a headache. I guess maybe that's a good way to go though. I feel really bad for the guy that was doing the portrait, because I feel like that would be very awkward. In our number 4 spot, we have the 34th President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight was a 5-star general in the Army during World War II before he became president. Dwight has been seen as an inactive president, but some things that he has been praised for are ending the Korean War and not starting any others in the meantime, and for stabilizing the Soviet-American rivalry. On March 28, 1969, Dwight ended up passing away at the Walter Reed Army Medical Center from congestive heart failure. He was 78 at the time, and his last words ended up being, "I want to go. God take me." I guess it's a good thing that he felt ready when it came time, but it is pretty scary to think that he had just kind of given up. Maybe his time in the war gave him some memories that he just didn't want to have anymore. Coming in at our number 3 spot, we have the 35th President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. The Kennedy family is one of the most politically established families in American history. John is highly regarded as a great president and actually came 3rd in a list of highly admired people of the 20th century. John and his wife were slightly younger than their predecessors, which gave them this sort of pop culture influence as well as their obviously political influence. On Friday, November 22nd, 1963 at 12:30 p.m., John was assassinated as he was traveling in a presidential motorcade throughout downtown Dallas, Texas. He ended up being struck by 2 bullets and was immediately taken to hospital, where he was pronounced dead 30 minutes later. While I don't have time to go into who assassinated him or why, I will tell you that his last words were to a woman named Nellie Connolly, who was traveling in the same car as him. She had said to him, "You certainly can't say that the people of Dallas haven't given you a warm welcome, Mr. President," to which he replied, "No, you certainly can't." It's crazy because they very obviously had no idea about what was just moments away from happening, but I'm glad that it seems like he was feeling welcomed and well loved before this tragic incident took place. Moving on to our number 2 spot, we have the 36th President of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon was the vice president to John F. Kennedy, but took over the presidency after the assassination we just talked about. When Lyndon first held office, he was looked down upon and had some pretty low ratings. Since then, however, he has began to become regarded as an above-average president, and some of the policies he put in place still exist and remain intact today. Lyndon shocked America when he decided not to run for a second term, but it was because he was worried about his health and being unable to make it all the way through. Lyndon had a bunch of heart problems and suffered 2 heart attacks. Surgery was considered for him, but doctors weren't sure he was healthy enough to be able to survive it. On January 22nd, 1973, Lyndon called for help on his telephone as he was suffering another massive heart attack. His last words were, "Send Mike immediately." Mike was his Secret Service agent who was housed not too far from where Lyndon was, but by the time Mike got there, it was already too late. I hate the idea that he died alone, but he lived a good life and accomplished a lot before his passing, and even if Mike was there, the outcome most likely wouldn't have been any different. In our number 1 spot today, we have the 37th President of the United States, Richard Nixon. Richard has quite the reputation for his second term due to the rise of Watergate, and was the only president who resigned from the position. There is a lot to unpack about Richard's second term, and we'll honestly have to save that for another video, but we will skip to what you're here for. On April 18th, 1994, Richard unfortunately suffered a stroke. He was awake and alert for a while, but unable to speak. Because of the trauma his brain had suffered, he ended up slipping into a coma before he passed away on April 22nd. Before the stroke, his last words were to his housekeeper, and all he said was help. It's really scary to know that he knew something bad was happening to him, but it really is even scarier to have been awake and unable to speak for the rest of the time after that. Luckily, when he did end up passing, he was 81 years old, and he had his daughters by his side so that they could tell him that they loved him and say their goodbyes.
Number 10. Peter Kürten. Peter Kürten was a German man known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf who took the lives and took advantage of many people between February and November 1929. The first death he definitely committed occurred on May 25th, 1913. During the course of a burglary, he encountered a girl named Christine Klein asleep in her bed. Peter strangled her, then slashed her twice across the throat with a pocket knife. Now this made him excited down there, if you know what I mean, due to him hearing the dripping from her wounds onto the floor by her bed and on his hand. He then did this multiple times to countless other victims. Then one day, Peter confessed to his wife that he was the Vampire of Dusseldorf, and in the information provided to detectives, his wife explained that although she had known her husband had been repeatedly imprisoned in the past, she was unaware of his culpability in any deaths. He was arrested and was charged with 9 counts of homicide and 7 of attempted homicide. Now he pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity to each of those charges, but he was found guilty and sentenced to death on 9 counts. Now he was also found guilty of 7 counts of attempted homicide. Now Peter displayed no emotion as his sentence was passed, and at 6 o'clock on the morning of July 2nd, 1931, Peter was beheaded via guillotine. Since he loved blood, his last words were, "Tell me, after my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear at the sound of my own gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be a pleasure to end all pleasures." Now that is just disgusting and ew. Number 9. Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan was the founder and first Khagan of the Mongol Empire, which later became the largest adjoining land empire in history. Having spent the majority of his life uniting the Mongol tribes, he launched a series of military campaigns which conquered large parts of China and Central Asia. In the 13th century, he ended the lives of so many peasants that carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were significantly reduced as a result. Now during his 21-year reign, his destructive armies were responsible for the deaths of up to 40 million people. He died in August of 1227, but his death was kept a closely guarded secret. Now according to legend, Genghis Khan's last words were, "I have conquered for you a large empire, but my life was too short to take the whole world. That I leave you." Now whether he uttered those short sentences or not, his successors were more than happy to take up the challenge. Number 8. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer ended the lives of many young men in Milwaukee, where he would then dismember them. It has been reported that he ended the lives of 17 males between 1978 and 1991. A detailed search of his apartment revealed 4 severed heads in his kitchen. A total of 7 skulls, some painted, some bleached, were found in his bedroom and inside a closet. Investigators discovered collected blood drippings upon a tray in the bottom of Jeffrey's refrigerator, plus 2 human hearts and a portion of an arm muscle. In his freezer, investigators discovered an entire torso, plus a bag of human organs and flesh stuck to the ice at the bottom. Elsewhere in the apartment, investigators discovered 2 entire skeletons, a pair of severed hands, 2 severed and preserved male sex organs, a mummified scalp, and in a 57-gallon drum, 3 further dismembered torsos dissolving in an acid solution. A total of 74 Polaroid pictures detailing the dismemberment of his victims were also found, which is just disgusting. Although he was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and a psychotic disorder, he was found to be legally sane at his trial. He was convicted of 16 counts of ending someone's life and was to serve 16 terms of life imprisonment on February 17, 1992. Then on November 28, 1994, he was beaten to death by Christopher Scarver, a fellow inmate. His last words were, "Christ Jesus came to the world to save all sinners, of whom I am the worst."
Next up at number 7 now we have Frida Kahlo. Born in 1907, Kahlo was a famous Mexican artist known for her portraits inspired by the nature and artifacts of Mexico. She spent much of the 1930s traveling around Mexico and the US, painting her works as she went. This eventually led to her landing her own exhibition in New York in 1938 and another the following year in Paris. On July 19, 1954, after years of illness, Kahlo died from a pulmonary embolism, although some people say she overdosed on painkillers. According to those close to her, her last words were, "I hope the exit is joyful and hope never to return." Next up at number 6 now we have Bing Crosby. This singer was a star of Hollywood's golden age and had a career that lasted over 50 years. You guys may know him as the singer of White Christmas, perhaps one of the most famous Christmas songs of all time. For the last few years of his life, Crosby had been recovering from a life-threatening fungal infection in his lung that had seen him go in and out of hospital. On October 14, 1977, he played 18 holes of golf with his friends. As they headed back to the clubhouse, Crosby said to them, "That was a great game of golf, fellas." Soon after, he collapsed and died instantly from a massive heart attack. Moving on to number 5 now we have Amy Winehouse. This English singer-songwriter became world famous for her music that spanned across genres such as soul, rhythm and blues and jazz. Her 2006 album Back to Black led to 5 Grammy Awards, making her the first British woman to ever do so. She had a much publicised battle with alcohol and drugs throughout her career, even referencing it in many of her songs. On July 23, 2011, her bodyguard found her unresponsive at her home in London. An ambulance was called, but she was pronounced dead on arrival. Her alcohol blood level was found to be 5 times the legal driving limit. She had seen her doctor just the night before, who claimed that some of her last words were simply, "I don't want to die." Alright, coming in at number 4 now we have Marie Antoinette. She was the last queen of France before the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century. As such, the revolutionaries tried her for high treason. She was found guilty and sentenced to execution by guillotine. As she climbed up the scaffolding, she accidentally stepped on the foot of her executioner. She turned to him and said, "Pardon me, sir, I meant not to do it." These would be her last words before her execution. Next up at number 3 now we have Barry White. During the 1970s, Barry White became one of the most popular soul singers in the world, famous for his distinctive bass voice and romantic image. For most of his career though, his image was also an overweight one. He was thought to weigh over 375 pounds and suffered from a number of related health problems. In 2002, he was hospitalized with kidney failure. The following year, White died in LA at the age of 58. According to a nurse who was treating him before he died, White's last words to her were, "Leave me alone, I'm fine." Next up at number 2 now we have George Harrison. He was one of 4 members of a band that you guys may have heard of, known as the Beatles. George died in 2001 after a long battle with cancer. According to his wife, Olivia Harrison, his last words to her were simply, "Love one another," which reflected the message he promoted throughout much of his time with the Beatles and the rest of his life. Harrison's family scattered his ashes, according to Hindu tradition, in a private ceremony in the Ganges and Yamuna rivers in India. And finally, number 1 now we have Charlie Chaplin. He is perhaps one of the most famous names of the 20th century. His comedy has transcended time and cross-language barriers. By the mid-1970s, Chaplin was well into his 80s and still had plans for future film projects. Unfortunately though, his health worsened to the point where he needed constant care. When it looked like his time had come, a priest was called to give him his last rites. The priest said, "May the Lord have mercy on your soul." Chaplin's reply, said to be his last words, was, "Why not? After all, it belongs to him." He died in his sleep on Christmas morning 1977 at the age of 88.